Thank you, Thomas, for accepting this interview. Maybe to start, maybe can you just provide some information about yourself, your background, what you do?
Yeah, I'm Tamás Berecz, and I've worked for the International Network Against Cyber Hate since 2016. I started out as the head of research and analysis, and for the past couple of years, I've been one of the operational managers. So I'm kind of responsible for overseeing most of our work. And I'm mainly responsible for overseeing our workflow within our framework partnership agreement with the European Commission. Um, and that work mainly involves monitoring activities. We monitor hate speech online. And it involves advocacy between the Commission, the NGO sphere, and the social media platforms that are signatories to the Code of Conduct on countering illegal hate speech online. And we are also in the beginning of building a cyber hate neutralization hub that will aim to map the sources of online hate and disinformation, and also map the bot networks that help widespreading these types of content. So yeah, that's us in a very small nutshell.
Well, it seems like I'm talking to the right person then. Thomas, could you please just briefly explain to our audience what hate speech is? What can we understand by it?
Yeah, I mean, hate speech is quite tricky to to define. I mean, if we want to be very basic or fundamental about it, then we can say that hate speech is, what the any given country, makes illegal, basically,
Mm.
and it's usually, based on certain protected attributes of certain groups or communities. So this means that hate speech is usually considered illegal speech that calls for violence or incites violence or demeans or denigrates certain communities that have protected attributes. This includes, race, ethnicity, national origins, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on and so forth. So most of these protected attributes, what they have in common is that we are, born with these attributes, so we cannot change them.
Mhm.
This we have one more group of protected attributes, which is usually religion, which is a little bit different because
Yeah.
most people can change their religion, but still, it is usually a protected attribute, but in a little bit of a different way, because it is protected in a sense that if somebody as a person is attacked or I mean verbally or hate is incited against them just because they are of a certain denomination or a certain religion, then it is hate speech. I mean, we at Enoch have our own definition of hate speech, which is very extensive and tries to cover all possible protected attributes. Most EU member states usually have a lot more restrictive view on hate speech, and they differ quite vastly between what they deem as protected attributes and what they don't deem as protective
Hmm.
attributes. The European Commission is pushing very hard to harmonize, this all across the EU, but there's still some ways to go.
Yeah. So would it be okay to say that most of the hate speech is generated towards minority groups then?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that sadly quite often, especially in Eastern European countries, anti-hate speech laws are quite often exploited and abused in a way to further oppress minorities. In a way, I mean, we here in Hungary, where I'm based, saw a few. Lawsuits and other type of you know things that were aimed, for instance, at members of the Roma community,
Yeah.
where there were, for instance, violent altercations between groups of far right or neo-Nazi, extremists and Roma people. And basically, the Hungarian authorities decided to bring, charges against, members of the Roma community because according to them, they were attacking the Hungarians or the white Hungarians, because they were white Hungarians. And so, that can definitely happen. But usually, yeah, these laws are there to protect minority communities.
Okay, thank you. If I'm a social media user, right, and I'm just scrolling down my feed, how can I identify some of the characteristics of hate speech online?
Yeah. I mean, what somebody can do if they really want to know what hate speech is go online, find a definition that they can agree with, because of course there are multiple definitions of hate speech online, and read it, and based on that, I think you can get a very clear sense of what constitutes hate speech and what doesn't, up until a certain point where people reach the gray zone, where there's a lot of harmful speech that's not
Mhm.
necessarily hate speech in general. And especially if we only think of hate speech that has been made illegal by a certain country, then that level goes even lower and the limits are even stricter. But in general, I think a definition like our definition, which can be found on our website. What we deem as hate speech, and also the different laws of the countries where our members are based can also be browsed on our website about hate speech. So somebody can very quickly, familiarize themselves with what hate speech is. What needs to be very clearly, I guess, stated is hate speech is not necessarily cyberbullying or cyber stalking or online harassment.
Mhm.
It can be part of it, but when we talk about hate speech, it's usually a much more generic thing. That attacks somebody based on them belonging a certain wider group or their perceived group, or attacking the group itself, basically. So it's
Mhm.
usually a lot less personal in general.
So it's less of a continued kind of harassment towards someone, but rather it could be just one comment
Yeah,
that's like replicating these
yeah.
notions of inferiority towards a minority group then.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Mhm.
very often in political debates nowadays on social media, we can see people being harassed on a regular basis,
Mhm.
and these people very often use hate speech. This can be especially true about misogynistic hate speech, which very often
Oh, yeah.
is something that can turn into personal harassment, for sure. But in general, hate speech is kind of a macro thing, not a personal or interpersonal thing in general.
Thomas, how do you think that hate speech has an impact on everyday life for people in like real life, material life? Because we think that this just stays on like a website. It's just a comment online. It doesn't really matter, does it? So how does it have a real impact on everyday's life for these people that are
Yeah.
actually being the victim of hate speech?
Yeah, I mean, it has a it has multiple effects on our public sphere in general, and on the communities that are most often targeted in different countries, because obviously the most prevalent hate types can differ from country to country based on the like for instance in Eastern Europe, it's like anti-Roma sentiment is usually up in the top. In Western European countries, anti-Muslim hate is usually more prevalent because there are more Muslim people than Roma people in Western
Yeah.
countries, and so on. So first of all, and that's why our motto is bringing the online in line with human rights, is that what we see is pervasive hate speech has a chilling effect, and it silences, the voices of the most vulnerable communities, who are already coming, with a handicap. Basically, they are already less represented. They are less, their voices are heard less often, and very often, when they do go online and they try to fight for their rights and argue their
Mhm.
point, they are silenced with a barrage of hate, basically that is aimed at them, and that very often leads to them going back to their shells, basically, their cocoons, and just say that, okay, this is just not worth it,
Yeah.
it affects my mental health, it can become dangerous even, if you are very, very vocal or an activist, you can get doxxed, you can get swatted, in the US, so it can get very dangerous personally, too. So they just say that, okay, I'm just gonna stop, so that silences people. That's one level of it. And the other one is even more, I think, it's even scarier, is that people think that hate crimes and genocides and atrocities and pogroms happen just out of the blue, or
Mhm.
something like that, but they are always preceded by hate speech campaigns and the dehumanization and the securitization of certain groups. I mean, if we look at the role of Facebook, in the, I don't even know what to call it, but the atrocities against the Rohingya people in Myanmar,
Mhm.
or or the role that WhatsApp plays in the lynchings and the beatings in India, by Hindu extremists against Muslim people. These are very, very good examples, or the incel terrorist attacks in the US,
Mhm.
or even Utoya in Norway, which was really back in the day. I mean, all these attacks, like, they never happen in a vacuum. They might be committed by so-called lone wolves, but these lone wolves usually had a community online, where they became more and more radicalized, where they were objected to these radical ideas, or if they had them already, they turned them into more dangerous radical ideas or extremist ideas.
Yeah, they
They usually have
legitimize
their,
they legitimize this, right? You have a
yeah,
support group
yeah,
that sort of
yeah,
prompts you to continue
yeah,
doing and thinking how
yeah.
you're thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, before the internet, you might have been sitting, alone, or have one or two friends, in the neighborhood that agreed with you. But now you can find a global community that kind of, nudges you on, and
Yeah.
supports you when you go out and commit something horrendous. We can also mention the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand,
Yeah.
the mosque attack. So what we see is that online hate speech, online radicalization always precedes these acts of extreme violence. So it's basically a hotbed for domestic terrorism against the most vulnerable communities.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, have you identified an increase in cyber hate in Europe, let's say, during the past few years? Or, I mean, because I know that you monitor these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question, because on one hand, thanks to our monitoring activities and the code of conduct that I mentioned, the most mainstream social media platforms that we monitor have become more and more void of very, very clear cut hate speech. Basically, I mean, their algorithms are becoming better and better. They are forced to pay more attention to it. They are forced to more stringently moderate the content that's on their platform. So it's getting actually increasingly hard to find very clear cut illegal hate speech on these platforms. I mean, it's not impossible, but it is getting increasingly hard. And we are moving much more towards the gray zone, to harmful speech, to dog whistle, to coded language. Because people learn how to avoid the algorithm, basically, and
Yeah.
how to stay in the gray zone, so they are not doing anything that's illegal in the country where they are based. Also, the internet is global, so if you think about forums or other places that are, for instance, hosted in the US, it's hardly, it's practically impossible to do anything against that. In the US, free speech is very, very widely understood. It's a very
Yeah.
broad interpretation of hate speech. And they only act against, hate speech where there is clear and present danger of actual violence, which is very, very hard to prove. And also, when it's very easy to prove, then the problem that we are trying to avoid already happened,
Yeah.
which is again another very, very big issue. I mean, now with the DSA, I think in within the EU, it's going to be harder and harder to for platforms to kind of be in this gray zone, where they try to somewhat comply with regulations, but not too much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have these quite popular, open chat platforms like Telegram,
Yeah.
that is pretending to kind of somewhat, try to adhere to different types of regulation, but not too much. Now with the DSA, I think they are facing a very difficult decision on how to proceed. But because we are pushing off hate speech from mainstream platforms more and more and better and better, we also see an uptick, in the alternative, social media platforms that are specifically there to give, a haven for a safe haven for these people to spread their extremist ideas. Gab, 4chan, 8chan, some servers on Discord,
Mm-hmm.
they provide a free for all platform basically for these people. I mean, it's partly a good development because most people don't use those platforms. So it's much more for people who are already there because they have these
Mm-hmm.
hateful ideas. I mean, it can be dangerous as we discussed previously, but at least what we can maybe reach in the near future is that if you are an average user with no radical ideas or no extremist ideas, you won't necessarily just run into accidentally something like that and then,
Mm-hmm.
being taken down the rabbit hole when you might get radicalized. I mean, that's a very, very important thing to or goal to reach. Um, on the other hand, throughout the pandemic, we definitely saw a development that was not practically completely new, but the sudden widespread of it, and the kind of this new force behind it was quite new, which is this complete amalgamation or mixture between hate speech and conspiracy theories and
Yeah.
disinformation. I
Yeah.
mean, previously, these were fairly separated. I mean, if we think about historically, anti-Semitism, very, very deeply rooted in conspiracy theories, for sure. I mean, especially in Europe, historically, going back,
Mm-hmm.
practically more than 1,000 years. But this wasn't necessarily true for other groups. And now basically what we see is that it's never only hate speech. It's always, some kind of disinformation, some kind of conspiracy theories that try to attack or securitize a certain group in society as being, deviant or having, sinister purposes, or spreading some kind of disease, with
Yeah.
COVID-19. I mean, for instance, the hate crimes and the growth in hate speech against Asian people due to COVID. So this is a new development for sure. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we will see nowadays is how to combat disinformation somewhat similarly to hate speech, which will be very hard because disinformation is one thing and you can maybe penalize that, but it's very hard to find the source that's actually disinformation,
Yeah.
through everybody else who's resharing this content, because that's only misinformation from then on. And you can't really, put 80-year-old grandmas, to prison or whatever because they shared something idiotic or a conspiracy theory on Facebook because they got, scared about
Mhm.
something that they saw on a fringe blog or whatever. So it's a very, very different type of beast, so to speak.
Thank you. Um, I was going to ask you, how can one protect oneself from like hate speech on social media? But I think a better question would be, how can one react to hate speech? Because not all of us are going to be targeted by it, but we are going to encounter
Yeah.
it through our interactions on social media. So should we engage with the people commenting on this? Should we like reply to them? Because you're like, what should I do? How should I react to
Yeah.
this?
It's really, really up to the person and what their limits are and how their mental health is.
Hmm.
If you think that you are just not up to it, you don't want to get into this, you get nervous, you get anxious, you get afraid, or it's just affecting you in a very negative way, then you absolutely just have the right, to like say that I'm not participating in this. You block the people, or you quit that group or whatever you can do to kind of avoid it from then on. So I think it's an absolutely valid coping mechanism to try to avoid this as much as possible. You don't need to feel that you have to be like the next person who saves the world or whatever. I mean, if you are just like there browsing Facebook or whatever and you run into a hotbed or like a very, very heated political debate riddled with hate speech, you can just say that, oh no, thank you, I'm not for this, and you just scroll down further, or even block the people who are there. If you want to do a little bit more, and that is fairly non-risky, you can go in and report via the provided reporting features.
Hmm.
Now all social media platforms have to have these by
Yeah.
now, and according to the code, if something is reported to them, they should assess it, within 24 hours and remove it if they deem it to be illegal or against their, policy guidelines. And you can do that with usually 3 or 4 clicks. So
Hmm.
it's not a lot of effort, to do that. So if you can get yourself to do that, I think that's very, very useful. Sadly, we find that as a normal user, single reports can still kind of fly under the radar, and very often they don't get removed. That's partially also, I think, because many people can't really differentiate between hate speech, harmful speech, heated political debate, bullying. But I think, I mean, if you feel that it kind of offends you, or you feel that this is not okay, report it. Worst case scenario, they won't remove it, but yeah. Um, if you want to do something more, then I think that's where we kind of reach counter speech level, basically, where you really engage, using different counter speech techniques. I'm not gonna get into those right now very, very deeply because I think this is not about that. But for instance, we have a online training space on our website. It's completely free, and there people can learn about media literacy, what hate speech is, what differentiates it from free speech, and we provide people with 6 to 8 different methods of counter speech that they can utilize if they wish so in their online life. These ranges from friendly warnings, to trying to humanize the attack group, to using humor, to
Mm-hmm.
trying to use counter narratives, and so on and so forth. But yeah, people have to know that, I mean, if you get into that, that is a lengthy process, and
Yeah.
it's not gonna work as a charm, and then so it can really take you down the rabbit hole a little bit if you go that way. So I mean, if the maximum that you would like maybe to do is to write to somebody that, look, this is not okay and probably illegal too, so you might want to take this down, or something like that. That's great. If that doesn't work and you don't want to go further, then you tried, and that's okay. I think going really deeply in it, for that you probably need to be some kind of an activist, working with a
Yeah.
group, or a volunteer at an NGO that works, with these types of things, because otherwise you'd be online all day trying to, like, do counter speech against people. So it's a very, very draining thing,
Yeah.
and everybody has, lives and jobs and families that they need to tend to. So I would understand, that not too many people would be willing to go that deeply into this.
Um, is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience regarding hate speech and digital safety?
yeah, I mean, as far as young people go, I guess, parents do have responsibility to be at least somewhat knowledgeable, what their children are doing online, and try to pay attention to certain clues, and signs that they might be being radicalized, for instance, by a men rights activist. Those are very popular nowadays, Andrew Tate and
Yeah.
many others, which are sadly appealing quite a bit to especially young teenage boys. So having discussions within the family, about values and how to kind of treat different types of communities and different types of people, and so on and so forth, can be very, very useful. Otherwise, I think, if you're an adult, and what you need to pay attention to is to try to consume information from sources that are highly likely that they are trustworthy. And what people need to understand, I think, is that um, being an independent media outlet, doesn't mean that a newspaper doesn't have an ideology, because many people, I think, mix up independence with complete neutrality. There is no complete neutrality in the
Yeah.
news. You will have left-leaning newspapers, you will have right-leaning newspapers, you will have newspapers that usually represent, the interests of the capitalist class, and so on and so forth. Um, but you just need to be knowledgeable about that, when you go in and read it.
Yeah.
But they will not, lie to you. The facts that they present are there. The events that they talk about happened. They just present it in a way, that probably fits their
Yes.
worldview. But if you know that worldview, then you can kind of peel that back off of it, if you don't sympathize with it or you don't like it or whatever. But you can get facts, because nowadays I think what we see is that many people just say that, well, opinions, are just opinions, and facts are basically just opinions, because we can look at
Yeah.
them, from different points of view. And that is true, but then, the fact is still the fact, even if you are interpreting it in multiple ways. So we just have to be, I think, knowledgeable about that. because if we don't, then everybody will just kind of get more and more dug in their own information bubbles and opinion bubbles, and we are already, I think, very, I'm not saying it's okay, not very close, but we are getting closer and closer, I think, to a complete communication breakdown in our public sphere, when we are not even living in the same reality anymore. We are so far removed from one another, and not even based on our experiences, but by the media that we consume.
Yeah, completely agree. I think sometimes we often forget that language shapes reality, the kind and speech shapes reality and the way
Yeah,
we perceive life, right? And as you said,
yeah,
there is differentiated access to information, and yeah, that definitely affects the way we behave, we perceive life. So,
yeah.
well, thank you for your time. I'm going to stop recording.